I'm horror author Paul Edwards. Tonight I'm watching The House That Dripped Blood from 1971, starring Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, Ingrid Pitt, and John Pertwee, who played Doctor Who in the 1970s. Hammer Studios had a lot of success with their horror films in the 1960s and 70s. And so a rival film company, Amicus Studios, decided they wanted in on this market, and they began a series of movies to rival those of Hammer Studios. In fact, they hired a lot of the same actors that regularly appeared in Hammer movies, including Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. One difference, though, is that Hammer Studios really enjoyed making period pieces. They made a lot of stories that were set in the late 19th century or early 20th century. Amicus couldn't be bothered. They couldn't be bothered to spend the money on vintage sets, props, costumes. They set their stories in the present day. Also, Amicus Studios decided early on that they wanted to focus on horror anthologies, a movie that was a collection of short stories. And they made several of these horror anthology films. This film, The House That Dripped Blood, was the fourth of the Amicus horror films. And all of the horror stories in this anthology movie were written by Robert Bloch, the guy who wrote Psycho. The wraparound story, the framework story in The House That Dripped Blood, is that a police investigator is being brought up to speed on the history of a creepy house in this quiet English countryside town. And he is being told the history of the house because he's investigating the most recent disappearance from the house. So this is the framework through which we hear each of the four stories. The first story is about a writer and his wife who move into the house, and the writer is working on his newest writing project, a horror story for which he's come up with a great horror character, Dominic the Strangler. He's fascinated by this character he's created, Dominic the Strangler. He just loves this character. In fact, he's so fascinated by the character that he starts to see Dominic the Strangler first around town, and then secondly, in his own home. And when his wife explains to him that there's nothing there, he thinks he's losing his mind and starts seeing a psychiatrist because, is that what's really happening here? Is the writer becoming obsessed with his own creation? Or is something completely different going on here? This story hits home for me because I am a horror writer, and I absolutely do not want any of my horror creations to take over my life. The second story is a wax museum story. Peter Cushing plays a man who visits a local wax museum and becomes fascinated with the statue of Salome, the biblical character who danced to please the king, and then as a reward, she asked for the head of John the Baptist on a silver platter. And Peter Cushing's character is fascinated by the Salome figure because it looks like a woman that he used to know. Ordinarily, I don't give spoilers out. In this case, I will tell you how this particular story ends because it's not a surprise. They used an image telling you how this story would end on the posters for the film. And if you're looking closely at your screen right now, you'll notice that behind me is a copy of the magazine Famous Monsters of Filmland, which has the image from the movie poster that tells you exactly what happens to Peter Cushing at the end of this story. And of course, it's not good. Now, I don't consider that a spoiler because the movie itself gave that away in their publicity materials. I mean, when you were waiting in line to buy your ticket, they already told you this was what was going to happen to Peter Cushing by virtue of putting it right on the movie poster. In fact, it's really not a very good image. If you look closely, you'll see that Peter Cushing's head is smaller than the head of the ghostly Salome figure who should be behind him. So her head should be smaller. But that's the image they went with, so that's story number 2. The Wax Museum story is effective, especially if you happen to have automatonophobia, the fear of lifelike human figures like wax museum dummies or department store mannequins. The third story, though, is, I think, a much better story, and it's my favorite in this film. This story stars Christopher Lee as a seemingly overly strict father who moves into this house with his daughter who's 6 or 7 years old. And he hires a nanny to homeschool her because he doesn't want her going out in public. He doesn't want the daughter going out in public. And he also has other strange rules. For instance, he doesn't want his daughter to have toys, especially dolls. Another odd thing that the nanny notices is that this girl has a strange terror of fire. It's normal to be wary of fire, but this little girl is horrified of fire. She starts shrieking when she sees an open flame. So the nanny is trying to figure out what is really going on and what is the secret to what is happening here. I will not ruin this one for you, but see if, just from the description I've given, see if you can figure it out. The seemingly overly strict father doesn't want the public exposed to his daughter, doesn't want the daughter to have any access to dolls, and the daughter is terrified of fire. Can you guess from that description what's going on here? If not, go watch The House That Dripped Blood, because it's worth seeing. It's an excellent story. The fourth and final story is about a horror actor played by Jon Pertwee. And he is renting the house while he's in town to star in a new vampire horror movie. Jon Pertwee's character is dissatisfied with the vampire costume that the cheap studio has provided him. And so he goes out himself to an antique store in search of an authentic-looking vampire's cloak. And he finds an old-timey cloak that looks just right. And so he buys it, and he wears it on set. But he quickly discovers that anytime he puts the vampire cloak on, he starts transforming into a vampire. And whenever he removes the cloak, he transforms back to an ordinary human being. Jon Pertwee based his performance in this story on his friend, the actor Christopher Lee, who was also in this same movie. He was the stern father back in the last episode. And of course, Christopher Lee had played Dracula on screen a bunch of times by this point. Jon Pertwee based his performance on Christopher Lee, although he didn't tell Christopher Lee this. Christopher Lee knew that Jon Pertwee was basing his performance on a real actor, but he had no idea that he was the real actor who was being emulated. And Jon Pertwee's performance, if you know this, his performance as a Christopher Lee-like actor is really funny. And they even put a more direct acknowledgement of it in a line where Jon Pertwee is talking about how much better the old horror movies were, especially Dracula. And he says, Bela Lugosi, of course, not the new guy, who, of course, was Christopher Lee. In case you're wondering, Christopher Lee and Jon Pertwee were friends, and this was not really an attack. This was, a good-natured ribbing by Jon Pertwee of his friend, Christopher Lee. So those are the 4 stories in The House That Dripped Blood. And, of course, the wraparound story ends with the police inspector just, having had enough of these wild stories, and he has to go and see the house for himself. And his visit to the house as the ending of the story. And you can imagine it's not good. The House That Dripped Blood is lacking one thing: Can you guess what it is? If you've seen the movie House That Dripped Blood, maybe you've noticed this. That's right, blood. There's no blood on screen in The House That Dripped Blood. None. In fact, this film is so tame that it was going to receive what we would have as the equivalent of a PG rating. But the studio was outraged. They couldn't have their horror movie get a PG rating, the equivalent of a PG rating. That would have been the kiss of death to their horror movie. They insisted on the equivalent today of an R rating. So they wound up eventually getting their wish, and The House That Dripped Blood was rated at the equivalent of an R when it was released. But in fact, this movie is perfectly fine for kids. And if you have a young horror and monster fan, or if you are a young horror and monster fan, The House That Dripped Blood is perfectly fine for all ages of monster kids. That's The House That Dripped Blood, a worthy entry into the series of Amicus anthology horror stories like Dr. Terror's House of Horrors and The Torture Garden and The Asylum. This film rates among their best. Listen, if you enjoy vintage horror and classic monsters, check out my book series, the Mourner's Woods books. I sell them on Amazon.com. My stories are all set in a haunted forest, and in each novel, a completely new cast of characters enters into Mourner's Woods, where they face a different adversary in each story. Monsters, ghosts, banshees. But invariably, the worst threat that a character encounters in Mourner's Woods is the friend who hiked here with them. Betrayal is a serious problem in Mourner's Woods, and a lot of times characters have to fight to escape not only from the ghosts and monsters, but from each other. My books emulate the feel and vibe of 20th century monster movies, but set in a contemporary setting and, of course, in printed form. My name again is Paul Edwards. My books are the Mourner's Woods books. Thanks for letting me talk to you about The House That Dripped Blood. And did you ever notice old horror movies used to have great horror titles? You knew you were seeing a horror movie if your film was called The House That Dripped Blood or The Earth Dies Screaming. They used to give horror movies a title where you knew it was a horror movie. Now they give horror movies titles like The Village, The Ring, The Mist. You know, those movies could be anything. If you didn't know what genre they were in, the title was not helping you. When you see a movie called The House That Dripped Blood, you know you're seeing a horror movie. Thanks for letting me reminisce about this great film with you, and I will see you in Mourner's Woods.